So our reading today is by Ellen Bass, and it's called Pray for Peace. Pray to whomever you kneel down to. Jesus nailed to his wooden or plastic cross, his suffering face bent to kiss you. Buddha still under the bow tree in scorching heat, Adonai, Allah. Raise your arms to Mary that she may lay her palm on our brows. To Shekinah, Queen of heaven and earth. To Inanna in her stripped descent. Then pray to the bus driver who takes you to work. On the bus, pray for everybody riding that bus, for everyone riding buses all over the world. Drop some silver and pray. Waiting in line for the movies or for the ATM, for your latte and croissant, offer your plea. Make your eating and drinking a supplication. Make your slicing of carrots a holy act, each translucent layer of the onion a deeper prayer. To hawk or wolf or the great whale, pray. Bow down to terriers and shepherds and Siamese cats, fields of artichokes and elegant strawberries. Or make the brushing of your hair a prayer, every strand its own voice, singing in the choir in your head. As you wash your face, the water slipping through your fingers, a prayer. Water, softest thing on earth, gentleness that wears away rock. Making love, of course, is already a prayer. Skin and open mouths worshiping that skin, the fragile cases we are poured into. If you're hungry, pray. If you're tired, pray to Gandhi and Dorothy Day, Shakespeare, Sappho, Sojourner Truth. When you walk to your car, to the mailbox, to the video store, let each step be a prayer that we all keep our legs, that we do not blow off anybody else's legs or crush their skulls. And if you are riding on a bicycle or a skateboard in a wheelchair, each revolution of the wheels, a prayer as the earth revolves. Less harm, less harm, less harm. And as you work, typing with a new manicure, a tiny palm tree painted on one pearlescent nail, or delivering soda, or drawing good blood into a rubber-capped vial, writing on a blackboard with yellow chalk, or twirling pizzas, with each breath in, take in the faith of those who have believed when belief seemed foolish, who persevered. With each breath out, cherish. Pull weeds for peace. Turn over in your sleep for peace. Feed the birds, each shiny seed that spills onto the earth, another second of peace. Wash your dishes, call your mother, drink wine, shovel leaves or snow or trash from your sidewalk, make a path. Fold a photo of a dead child around your Visa card. Scoop your holy water from the gutter. Gnaw your crust. Mumble along like a crazy person, stumbling your prayers through the streets.
It was my first night on call, serving as a chaplain at a regional hospital in Iowa a couple of years ago. When the pager sounded its alarm, it was about 1:30 in the morning, and I had been a chaplain for maybe 3 days. That night I was called to the emergency department. We had an inbound patient undergoing CPR, family on its way. And I arrived at the emergency room at the same time as the ambulance. The patient was a 42-year-old man, His wife, Beth, arrived with a family friend a few moments later. And I sat with Beth and her friend and waited for news from the doctors. As we waited, we talked, and I learned that Beth and her husband had 3 children. I learned that they had recently celebrated their 14th year of marriage. I learned that he was a really big fan of the Three Stooges. The doctor came in and told us that they had revived this man, and we collectively gasped our relief and gratitude. Beth turned to me and asked me to pray. Pray? Well, okay. I was the chaplain. It wasn't an unreasonable request. It's just that, as a Unitarian Universalist with ambivalent feelings towards God and a healthy dose of uncertainty as to what a prayer really is, I wasn't really comfortable with that. I'd rather leave that to someone else to handle. Only that night, in that emergency department, there was no one else. So I did the only thing I could. I grasped her hands, I bowed my head, and I started praying. I don't remember what I said. I'm guessing I mumbled something through some thoughts of gratitude for those who had resuscitated her husband and asked for strength and healing for the family. And as I finished my awkward attempt at prayer, she actually thanked me. And as I finished, we looked up, and the doctor had returned again. Her husband had stopped breathing, and they had restarted CPR. By this time, he had been under resuscitation for almost an hour. And the doctor wanted to know from Beth how much longer should they keep trying. She looked at me, dead in the eyes, straight in my eyes, and said, "I'm going to need a minute with that one." The doctor said, "Of course, take what you need." I think it took exactly 60 seconds. She lifted her head and looked at the doctor in the eye and said, "I love him. I have to let him go. It's time." In the space of an hour or so, we, in that room, went through the entire range of human emotion. The metaphor of a roller coaster comes to mind, even though that falls desperately short of what that experience was for us, except that at the end, we were all stumbling. Our words inadequate, our bodies shaken. As this past week's events have unfolded, we all perhaps have been confronted by this range of human emotions. The confusion and horror when we learn of these bombs exploding at the Boston Marathon, the wonder and awe and pride as we watch the first responders rush to aid the wounded, the even greater sense of admiration for these runners who ran an extra mile to get to the hospital to give blood. And perhaps for some of us, there were anxieties of wondering about the safety of our friends or our family, our loved ones who were to be present in Boston last Monday. And then there was the sadness of these terrible, as we learned of the terrible wounds and the tears we shed as we later learned the names and the stories of those who died: Christy Campbell, Lou Lingji, Martin Richard. And then the week progressed through these twists and turns of emotions. Suddenly, suspicious email is sent to members of Congress and the president, and an explosion in Texas devastates a small town. And then Friday comes, and Friday's intense tensions as the entire metropolitan area of Boston withdrew into the safest places they could find as police searched for a desperate young man. And we held our breath. At some point in the afternoon on Friday, my stomach muscles were hurting. And I realized that the entire day they had been clenched in my anxiety. And perhaps some of us, myself, perhaps especially, the week includes a large dose of anger and frustration. Mine's usually directed towards the television. I scream a lot at the TV, at our media. They are an easy target for my anger. But when I take a moment to look beyond my frustration with the media, I'm aware that that response is not so much really anger at the news media. It's perhaps a response to something deeper. This carnage in Boston only serves to underscore my fear. When I kiss my daughters goodbye in the morning, as they head to school, I try really hard to remember that despite Columbine all the way through Sandy Hook, that I have a reasonable expectation that my daughters will come home to me in the afternoon, smiling, unharmed, and perhaps a little wiser than when they left. Or when I take my family to the movie theater, I work hard to forget last summer's events in Aurora, Colorado, and try to simply enjoy an escape of a good story, well told, reasonably certain that we will return to our home giggling about our favorite part of the film. But, you know, over the years, particularly these years of my adult life, our public spaces, these places where we can share our living with each other, keep getting violated. And with each transgression, my fears accumulate. And I find myself tired of having again to ride the roller coaster of emotions, tired of trying to stem my fears and live out a life of peace and joy and wonder. It is exhausting. There's a blog called The Dictionary of Obscure Sorrows. And it's written by a man named John Koenig. He's a graphic designer in St. Paul, Minnesota. And in the Dictionary of Obscure Sorrows, Mr. Koenig invents new words, invents new language to describe what he calls the urges, vibes, aches, and demons inhabiting the interior psychological landscape. I must tell you, Mr. Koenig's work is becoming one of my new scriptures. In a post from December 8th of last year, he offers this new word. I pronounce it kubiko. Kubiko. It's K-U-E-B-I-K-O. Kubiko. And he defines this as a noun, meaning a state of exhaustion inspired by acts of senseless violence, which force you to revise your image of what could happen in this world, mending the fences of your own expectations, weeding out all unwelcome and invasive truths, cultivating the perennial good that's buried under the surface, and propping yourself up like an old scarecrow, bursting at the seams, but powerless to do anything but stand there and watch. In talking with people this week and reading the coverage and the responses to this week's events, I think kubiko is where many of us may stand. It's a state of exhaustion, a sense of powerlessness, a wondering of what to do, of how to live into this world both as it is and against how we imagine it could be. Our exhaustion, though, is understandable. It just gets to be too much. And sometimes when we find ourselves immersed in this exhaustion, we close ourselves off to what is happening around us. We disconnect in an attempt to protect ourselves. I know that I often put up this wall between myself and the world, only letting in the safe stuff, the stuff that doesn't make me sad or angry, the stuff I know I can deal with, that doesn't require anything of me. It's my happy place. Only it's really not all that happy, but it's certainly never going to be all that sad either. In our exhaustion, too, sometimes we find ourselves inured, resigned to living in this world where we can't guarantee a perfect safety for ourselves, for our children, for our loved ones. There are too many people out there. There are too many people who are broken, who are lost, who are disconnected from their lives and the lives of people around them, people who are, for myriad of reasons, so detached from themselves and other that what pours forth from them can only be called evil. And I know, as Unitarian Universalists, we stumble over this idea of evil. It's that whole inherent worth and dignity thing. And our internal paradox of trying to hold multiple things as true, even if they're contradictory. Like the very idea that these two young men who are suspected of these heinous acts of violence can also be two young men who are loved by their friends and their family, whose lives had, even deserved, inherent worth and dignity. Can you hold that? Can you hold both of those as true? Really? Did you feel any relief when you heard that one of these alleged bombers was dead? And again, when another was captured? Koenig's definition of kubiko goes beyond the exhaustion. He reminds us that beyond this fatigue lies real work of mending the fences of our expectations. There are unwelcome and invasive truths. Certainly the violence that we continue to be witness to invades our individual and perhaps collective dreams of a more peaceful world. How do we mend our expectations? Our expectations that all people everywhere be peaceful, be at ease, be whole, against a world that seems to violently attack every corner of peace that we try to hold. A hint of how we do this may lie in where we choose to focus our attention. The first time I read that Fred Rogers quote that we opened the service with was after the shootings at Sandy Hook. The quote had become sort of an internet meme on social media sites. Look for the helpers, he reminds us. So perhaps to mend our expectations, we should remember the story of Carlos Arredondo. Mr. Arredondo is the man in the cowboy hat. You may have seen pictures of him this week. He is shown helping to wheel a victim of the Boston Marathon bombing to an ambulance. The photo is really graphic and gruesome, and I won't describe it here. But suffice to say that Mr. Arredondo is one of those people who rushed in after the bombs exploded to help in whatever way he could. He helped save at least one life and probably many more. Mr. Arredondo is not a first responder. He's not a policeman, a fireman, an EMT. He's a father whose life has been invaded by violence. You see, his son, Alex, was killed in Iraq. And when the Marines came to inform Carlos Arredondo of his son's death, he attacked the van the Marines were riding in, smashed it with a sledgehammer, and then set it on fire. And in his sorrow, in his despondence, and in setting this van on fire, he set himself on fire. And he survived that. Only years later to have a second son who was consumed by addiction, complete suicide. In an interview following his second son's death, he said, "We are a broken people." In Koenig's definition of the word kubiko, as we deal with all those unwelcome and invasive truths, we must also cultivate the perennial good, he says. Cultivate that perennial good that's buried under the surface. Carlos Arredondo's life contains, I'm sure, many unwelcome and invasive truths beyond the ones I have just shared. And any of those truths could have exhausted him and left him closed off from the world. Instead, he decided, he chose, he went and cultivated the good. After his son died in Iraq, he became a peace activist. And last Monday, he rushed into the confusion and the chaos of the street after the explosions. He saved lives. Look for the helpers. They will help you cultivate the good and mend your expectations. I read also this week another posting on the internet, this one from a comedian named Patton Oswalt. And during his post, he focuses a lot of attention, again, on these number of people who in the midst of the mayhem rush in to serve their fellow human beings. And at the end, he writes this, he says, "We would not be here if humanity were inherently evil. We would have eaten ourselves long ago." So when you spot violence or bigotry or intolerance or fear or just garden variety, misogyny, hatred or ignorance, just look it in the eye and think, the good outnumber you, and we always will. And even as we do that, though, and even as we take that step, I am aware of the powerlessness we sometimes feel, particularly in these moments of profound crisis. And Kubiko points to this as well, of being, quote, like an old scarecrow who's bursting at the seams but powerless to do anything but stand there and watch. You know, there are those who by training or by circumstance rush in to help, run towards the danger. And then there are the rest of us. What are we to do? And here's where I disagree with Koenig just a little bit, because I do not think it is powerless to do anything but stand there and watch. You know, we may be hundreds of miles away from Boston, from Sandy Hook, from Aurora, thousands of miles away from Syria, from Afghanistan, from Egypt. But we can bear witness. And perhaps this is one of the most powerful things that we can do. You know, on my first overnight at chaplaincy, I didn't do anything. I didn't do anything more than bear witness to the great sorrow that was unfolding before me. I wasn't a doctor or nurse, an EMT, trained to save the life of a patient. Heck, I was not even really trained to be a chaplain. I wasn't really sure what being a chaplain meant, and possibly the only expectation that anyone would have had of me was to be able to offer a prayer, and I could barely do that. But bearing witness, being present to the reality, to the emotions, both my own emotions and Beth's emotions, that was what there was for me to do. And the power of that kind of presence was made clear to me weeks after this incident with Beth and her husband. And I was at the hospital again, a long weekend, long overnight, on call. And at about 10 o'clock at night, I was called to the ICU. A patient that I had been visiting off and on over the last couple of weeks had taken a turn for the worse, and they were putting a ventilator in. And I sat with his wife, Betty, in the waiting room of the ICU for 7 straight hours, 10 o'clock at night to 5 o'clock in the morning. And in those 7 hours, I am pretty sure I didn't say more than 10 sentences to her. And she said even fewer back to me. We just sat. And at about 5 in the morning, Betty's sister arrived, and as they tearfully greeted each other, I heard Betty say, "You know, I don't know what I would have done if Chaplain Greg hadn't been here tonight." My presence, just being there, to bear witness to her anguish, to her husband's struggle with his illness, to the host of medical personnel that worked tirelessly to keep him alive. My presence, not my words, not my actions, my presence was powerful enough to make a difference in this woman's life. Our bearing witness as a scarecrow bursting at the seams. It's not nothing. It is not powerlessness. It is perhaps the most healing thing we can do. And we do it here. And we do it here each time we gather wanderers and worshipers. Each time we come again to return here to the homes of our souls, we bear witness to our joys and our sorrows, both large and small. This perhaps is the grace in this word, kubiko. When I sat with Beth that night in the emergency room, she asked me to pray. At that time, I had not read Ellen Bass's words. So I was pretty much stuck in a traditional idea of what prayer was. But later, when I discovered Ellen Bass's Pray for Peace, I saw that she tells us that while our prayers may begin as supplication to some religious icon, to Jesus, to Buddha, to Allah, they never end there. She tells us that every action we take can be a holy act. That every rotation of the wheels that turn our lives can be a prayer. Less harm, less harm, less harm. Kubiko, this word so eloquently coined by John Koenig, is also a prayer. I think it is a shaping of our desires, the shaping of our desires in light of unspeakable violence. It is a hope that we return to when we gather together again to bear witness, to pour out our love into a world that is broken and hurting. It is not a promise. It is not a promise of absolute safety and security. Instead, it is a bold claim that we are a people of resilience and tenacity. There's a reflection on the Boston Marathon bombing that was posted on the website for The Nation magazine. In it, author Dave Zirin writes about the resilience of the runners, the tenacity of those who commit to running 26.2 miles. And in his conclusion, he promises this. He says, "We will run next year. We will run next year because the alternative is too awful to contemplate." Friends, indeed, we will run. We will send our children to school. We will go to theaters and to the shopping malls. We will go to our work. We will go to church. We will be present. we will bear witness. And in so doing, our lives will be our prayer. Indeed, we will run, stumbling our prayers through the streets. Amen. And blessed be.